has recommended that history is made compulsory from grade 10 and that it eventually replaces life orientation. The Ministerial Task Team has also recommended that history become a standalone subject. The proposed changes would be phased in from 2023. The team also found that the curriculum was too Eurocentric. It conducted comparative studies with other African countries as well as Europe and South America to see just how they are teaching history at schools in those jurisdictions. At present, pupils take history up to grade 9 and are then allowed to drop it. Well, to talk more about this, we're now joined by Sekiba Lekgoathi, who is an associate professor of history and member of the Ministerial Task Team, as well as eNCA senior researcher Angelo Fick. Good evening to both of you gentlemen. Thanks very much for coming through it. If I may start with you, Prof. I mean, government trying to end what appears to be shall we call it, ingrained apathy to our past as the subjects have continued over the years. I mean, history in particular has continued to play second fiddle, some would say, to mathematics and science.
Thanks, Vuyo. Absolutely. History has not played an important role in our curriculum. And it's not a new thing. It goes back to the past. Even, in the pre-colonial era, or rather, not in the pre-colonial, but in the apartheid era, you had a situation where history was basically a subject that was part of the general stream, right? Those students who were not doing well in maths, in mathematics and science would be pushed into the stream as a general stream. So basically that has had an effect in the way that history is basically broadly perceived in society, that it's a subject only for those learners, those students who are incapable in general.
But I mean, that view is quite pervasive, Angelo, isn't it? That history is merely, a subject where you just have to remember the events and the times at which they happened.
Well, the irony of that, of course, is that as I come to the end of my history at eNCA tonight, talking about history is not about dates. It's not about what happened and then what happened and who it happened to. But it's actually about constructing arguments, about understanding the world, our relationship to the world, the relationship of the present to the past, in order to understand the present better. And that is not about whether or not you believe something happened on a particular date, but understanding the processes by which we get to understand that. And this, I think, is a plea more generally from my side to the humanities more generally. This opposition between the sciences and the humanities is a false opposition because it is not a choice of either or. If you're going to have people who are going to become doctors or engineers, they certainly have to have an appreciation of the history, of their context, and of the world as a whole in order to be fully rounded human beings. And similarly, if you're going to have people who are in the humanities, they need to have a scientific understanding of the world in order to separate irrationality from rationality. And so this opposition that many people have between what a subject like history and a subject like physical science is, I think, a really false opposition, because the best physical scientists in history have often been great historians as well.
In other words, it could not be far from the truth that the subject is in fact incapable of fostering thinking skills.
No, in fact, history is crucial to fostering thinking skills because it is about making sense of the world in context and being able to construct an argument. So as I've said before, teaching history, and as the professor would be able to outline far more specifically as an expert in the field, isn't about teaching people specific dates in the past and what they meant, but about an understanding and a relationship to the past that they can make sense of it in order to know what the present looks like as a consequence of those events in the past.
Yeah. Prof, how much of this is really, or at least in part, a realization suddenly that after all mathematics, and science aren't actually giving, our children what we or many people thought they would?
I think this decision now to sort of think of history and introducing it as a compulsory subject, it's actually informed by a lot of things that we have actually been observing about how, ignorance about what is actually happening around us in society has been ingrained much more generally. And history is one of those subjects that can actually act against those things, like the knowledge of many children, in fact, even adults. I mean, the level of ignorance of our context, our society, how is it that as a country we have come to be where we are now? I think with history, with a good understanding of history and a good implementation of a history curriculum, you can be able to begin to understand our past so that we can grapple with the questions that we are facing here today. I think one of the, issues that really aches me a lot is when you talk to a lot of people in terms of how they think about themselves as South Africans. And you hear a person traveling on the African continent saying, I'm going to Africa. Where are we? Clearly we are South Africans. South Africa is part of the African continent, and the African continent is part of the world. So history is one discipline that actually ingrains that knowledge about who we are, as would be able to ingrain that knowledge in terms of who we are, not just about the facts, but also about the skills, the different interpretations, because history is about interpretation. And how do you put together, how do you synthesize different interpretation to make logical arguments? So there's a lot about history. When we reduce history to facts, to dates, to places, when we reduce history to simply big men, the politicians, political history, then we have lost it. We shouldn't be surprised then when children are saying history is boring.
Well, I'm glad you're mentioning that, but we're going to talk about the boring part in a short while. But I want to come to Angelo about the fact that history has always been taught from a particular vantage point, and that is going to be critical on the back of this decision.
So my understanding is that when people talk about the teaching of history, it's the implementation of a curriculum, and that's always going to be flawed, because you're always going to have people who do not believe what they're expected to teach, and here it has to do with the qualifications and making sure that teachers are skilled as historians in order to teach history. If you're not skilled as an historian and you don't have an historical imagination, as a teacher, of course, you're going to reduce it to dates and places and people. But if you know that you're teaching a way of arguing about the world that is open to contestation and is open to contestation inside a logical paradigm that requires evidence-based argument, history becomes a far richer terrain. We have a history of bad history teaching in South Africa. Christian nationalist, racist, white supremacist education gave us bad historiography and bad history. But the response to that from historians like Harold Wolpe or Martin Legassick, among others, also gives you a rich insight into how you can write counter-histories to the dominant historical tradition of that period. And contestations around how colonialism wrote histories in Southern Africa, those have been ongoing. So I think of people like Saul Dubo in A Commonwealth of Knowledge. I think of the situated histories of saying that it's not just about big men and battles, it's also about ordinary social histories of what happens in communities, what happens to people, women's perspectives in histories. What is it like to tell history from the perspective of women's experiences as opposed to from battles? Those kinds of things are very important because they tell us something about the world and they construct an argument about the past for us to read the present more productively.
Well, I want to explore those issues further, but we are going to do that when we come back from this quick ad break.